Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Thursday presentation of the future of transport planning. I'm Thomas, and I'm here to talk about transport planning, what it is, how it's important, and how it will affect transport for years to come. So a little about myself. I'm a graduate transport planner at Stantec. We offer consultancy services to both private companies and public companies like the government, and we try to build better communities. Before that, I graduated from the University of Aberdeen in 2021, where I studied economics. And before that, I was in high school in the United States, where I'd always had an interest in understanding the world around me. Transport was always really interesting for me, as I always wondered how everyone could get from one place to the other. And that's what really drew me to a career in transport planning. Now, before I explain what transport planning is, I'd like to ask you to get into groups or by yourself and answer the following questions. So firstly, I'd like to ask, what do you think transport is and why do you think it's important? I'd like you to think about, how do you travel to school when visiting friends or going to the shops? And to also think about, why do you travel this way? And is it because it's easy, cheap, or effective? Or if there's any other reason? And if you could answer those questions through Menti, either by the QR codes or through the code below. And I'll come back in about 5 to 10 minutes, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. And if you could just respond through Mentimeter, please. Okay, everyone, we've got a couple more minutes left. If you've managed to complete those questions, feel free to send those off. Okay, everyone, hope you had enough time to reflect there. Apologies, skipping ahead. So when we think of transport in a transport planning sense, we think of it as the movement of people and goods from one location to another. So in the questions about how you get around, we really think about how you would do that or how you're most likely to do it. So in some cases, is it by car because it's easier? Is it by bus because it's cheaper and quicker? Or is it by train because it's a long distance journey? We also like to think about transport connectivity. So we like to think about how easy it is to get to those places. So if you had said, for example, you take the car because it's easier to drive than take the bus, we like to think about why that could be the case and how we could change that. This is where we come in as transport planners. So we like to think of transport planning as preparing, assessing, and implementing policies, plans, and projects to improve and manage how we get around. When doing this, we have to think about how the government wants us to invest in infrastructure and what's possible. As much as we'd like to build a monorail through the city of Edinburgh to Glasgow, it just isn't going to be likely. We try to understand why people and goods travel the way they do too. And this comes in the form of analysis through data and other means such as talking to people. From that, we look at how this can be improved to increase connectivity, which I said before is how we connect between our homes, schools, and shops. When doing this, we look at all forms of transport, mainly walking, cycling, car, bus, and train. In most cases, the size of our projects really do vary, with some projects covering only one street, which we call a corridor, and to covering an entire region, such as Dumfries and Galloway, which is shown on the map. We like to think of transport planning as being different from engineering or residential planning. We like to think of it as a connection between building homes and the actual construction. We don't build designs on actual roads. We simply just say how we can travel on those roads and what additional infrastructure will need to be built to enable us to get from point A to point B a lot easier. We usually have not done engineering degrees or planning degrees, and we often come from a geography, economics, science, logistics, or academic background. That being said, however, it is possible to become a transport planner as a school leaver through an apprenticeship. So what do we actually do as transport planners? So what I like to think of it as telling stories about the study area and identifying problems. So firstly, once we have a project, we have to identify the study area. Are we looking at one big corridor, or are we looking at the area around that corridor? And it really depends on what we're tasked to do. Once we've identified the corridor, we then find data about jobs, health, and current transport options to understand the current information or provision of transport. This allows us to understand whether a community might be struggling because it's hard to get around, or whether there's any infrastructure that might need to be upgraded. We also, on every project, speak to people and businesses who will be affected to ensure we have the best solution for them. Sometimes we visit sites to gain an understanding of the problems, which you can see on the right. Once we've identified the problems, we figure out whether there could be a lack of jobs nearby, low income, or maybe no transport. And from that, we find the best solution to the problem to increase connectivity based on what we find out above. From working in this job for just over a year now, I found that no 2 days are the same. Some projects have completely different corridors requiring completely different analysis. And usually when we do this work too, we also work with the government or private companies, which again alters what I do from day to day. So to understand what we do, I've listed a couple topics that I cover in my day-to-day work. As I said, no 2 days are the same. So some of these things I do on a daily basis, and others I might not do that frequently. Firstly, as I said previously, we look to identify transport problems. But what are they? We like to think of transport problems as current issues with the transport system that affect costs, journey times, and cause problems for neighboring communities. Now, this can be related to infrastructure too. So how easy it is to get to a bus stop, is there a path, or whether the bus stop is actually convenient, is placed conveniently, and it's comfortable to wait in for a bus. Now, we make sure to look at all transport systems within a study area. So this might include bus, rail, or just walking around. And we try to understand where these problems are in the system and what needs to be done to fix them. For example, when we're looking at rail connections at stations, we might look at data from timetables to understand exactly how long it might take to get from point A to point B, and whether it's possible to take the train while going to work, or if it's more convenient to drive. Another really important set of information we look at, and this I do daily, is look at socioeconomic problems. Now, socioeconomic problems are what we consider to be where towns and cities have problems connecting to jobs, health, and housing, which makes it difficult to earn higher wages and also to make it to school. Areas that have many socioeconomic problems are called deprived areas. And we use a data set named the Index of Multiple Deprivation, or SMID in Scotland, to see where these areas are and what types of deprivation there are. So if you look at the map on the right, the darker red areas represent areas that have higher levels of deprivation. Deprivation can occur in multiple categories, such as access to education, access to healthcare, so going to see your GP, and just general wage income. The areas that are darker red represent a higher level of deprivation. So this means that these areas have a lot more issues accessing services, while the ones that are darker blue have less of these issues. We then look back at the transport problems to see if one of these, if a transport problem could be fixed to help the socioeconomic ones and increase connectivity to other services. So how do we actually show these problems? So we use a variety of different measures to display the problems. Got two examples on the right. We really love to put charts and tables in to really visualize the data. A lot of the data we collect comes from spreadsheets that just have tons and tons of numbers. And it's really my job to make that story and display the data better. So what we do then is we tidy up the data so the story we're trying to tell is easiest for everyone to read. I also briefly mentioned there that we make maps. And this map is an example of us trying to show a transport problem. So this is a route of all the bus maps in an area within England. Now, as you can see, there's quite a lot of buses between Oswestry and Shrewsbury, which are the two largest towns within this area. However, you can see there's not really other services connecting outwards to other towns. And this transport problem is really trying to show that it's difficult to get around by public transport in this area. And from analyzing this, we came up with a solution to implement additional buses and help increase connectivity and reduce deprivation. We also undertake a lot of consultation on projects. So we try to speak to the public to understand what problems they face when you try to use the public transport system. And this can range from a bus not being on time, it's difficult to get to work using the bus, or it just may be too expensive. We also speak to stakeholders, which we consider to be organizations, to understand how they work and what we think what we need to think about. In some cases, these organizations can be transport oriented. So in some cases, we speak to Transport Scotland, who can tell us if something's easy to implement or if it might be a bit difficult. We like to think of this as the most important part, is we need everyone to understand what may happen and how we can help. Once we've analyzed all the data, we usually write a very large report. And some reports can be over 100 pages due to all the data, but once we've analyzed the data, it's really quite simple. And as I said earlier, it's really just like telling a big story. There's a variety of transport planning sectors within my role. So in some cases, we like to do business cases, which we look at what type of intervention or things we should build and how it should be done and how much it may cost. Usually we don't do anything, nothing gets built right afterwards, as there's maybe a couple more stages, but it's like laying the concrete of building a house. We also do modeling, which is how we try to understand how busy something is and how it will be in the future and whether any changes to existing infrastructure may be made. We also do strategy development, which is trying to ensure that transport is planned for the future, and so the government will support it. And in doing this, we have to look through a lot of government policy to gain an understanding of what will be funded and what might not be. Some of the methods, such as modeling, do involve more maths than others, but all the methods allow you to tell a story. So I have two projects in the following slides that I've worked on. These are two completely different projects and two different styles, and there's very many more ways of conducting transport planning. So don't feel like these are the only things that you might do if you do become a transport planner. Firstly, one of the projects I worked on is called Restoring Your Railways Business Case. So this is a case that looked at reopening a small railway in England to connect two small communities. The project involves speaking to members of the community and researching how people traveled. Was it by bus? Did they drive between the two? And ensuring we understood why they did that. We researched alternative options to ensure reopening the railway was the best method when compared to other projects. We also wanted to see how journey times would be when compared to the car if we can move people from car to train. And this wasn't just from the surrounding area. This was also to large settlements nearby. Another project I've undertaken was an economic parking assessment within North Berwick. We wanted to see whether it's possible to let people park in places they want to go to, but also not make the streets too full of parked cars and people looking for car parking spaces. We want to make sure that the council lost money by implementing any new parking controls, such as permitted parking, and that tourists and residents wouldn't have to pay loads of money. We wanted it to be simple and effective and not be confusing for users, and also be effective in the future with the rise of EV charging. This project is still underway, but from the modeling, we've seen that implementing a residential parking scheme may be the best option. Now I want to look at the future of transport planning and what it might hold and how it might affect everyone. Firstly, the way in which the government wants us to move is changing, with walking and wheeling prioritised ahead of private car journeys. The Scottish Government wants to reduce the amount people drive by about 20% to reduce emissions. In doing so, the government wants the money that we spend on transport to go towards walking and wheeling, as it's the healthiest way of transporting ourselves and goods, and then in decreasing investment for the following ones below walking and wheeling. You might be able to see that if you're under the age of 22, that you're able to get a free bus pass, and this is one of the many initiatives. When we plan transport, we have to consider how demand will shift, so how many people use the bus. And with these policies, more people are more likely to take the bus, which we have to consider when planning transport. Another way transport planning is shifting is the way people choose to move is different. The fuel we use is more expensive, which is making more people buy fully electric cars, which requires charging points. Most people are also not buying cars, they're buying Netflix-like subscriptions to a car where they can book it by the hour. And this requires spaces for people or spaces for cars to park that people can access them. Some people now walk and cycle when they would have previously taken the car, which means we also have to consider about how cars and people can share the roads. And as transport planners, we need to consider how people will choose travel in the future and plan for it. Now, I just want to briefly speak about how you can get involved and explain transport planning to others. So, transport planning does not require one specific degree. And if you want to become interested, I'd say to start, take an interest in how you get around. Is there any specific reason that you're doing it? And then ask others the reason they travel the way they do. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions you'd like to ask me, feel free to ask through the Menti, and I'll be here for the next 15 minutes or so to answer your questions. So one question is, what's the best thing about being a transport planner? I like to think it would be the difference in day-to-day stuff. You're not stuck doing one thing. Some days I might be doing data analysis, other days I might be writing a report and telling a story. And you really do have a lot of opportunities to go on site visits and speak to people in their communities. I'm based in Edinburgh, and I've been able to go down south to Leeds, and also up towards Inverness to speak to people. And you really are able to get a connection about where their problems are. And it really, personally, to me, is just exciting to be able to make a difference in their local communities. Another question I have here is, what's your favorite type of transport? Um, I would say probably cycling. I love cycling on the weekends and just getting out in nature and being able to do it. That being said, I do drive and take the bus, but cycling where I can is honestly my most favorite type of transport. Should Another question is, should everyone drive electric cars? Um, no, not everyone should drive electric cars. It's more about changing to renewable, to less emissions. So if you want to and can afford to get an electric car, then that might be the best option for you, especially if you're able to charge it. But for others, if it's possible to take the bus, that is still reducing emissions as there's more people taking one mode of transport. It really depends on what your situation is and what's the most cost effective thing for you, or the cheapest thing. Another question is, what's the biggest challenge in transport planning to meet net zero aims? That would be car reuse or car emissions. The mode share, so the amount of people who use car to get around and get to work, is still very high. It's roughly about 60 to 70%, depending on where you live. So obviously in cities, it's not as big of an issue as there's a lot of public transport. But if you live in a rural community, so up in the Highlands, for example, you have to depend on car to get around. So we have to think of a way that we can provide other means of transport that's reducing emissions to rural areas, where it might be more expensive to do it. And we've still not found the best answer to that too. It's a combination of things, but it really depends on where that is. Another question is, how can we improve road safety? Really depends. Again, it depends on the area. For cities where we're seeing a lot more walkers and cyclers, it's really thinking about how we integrate walking and cycling in road use. The Scottish Government really wants to encourage active travel. So in doing so, we have to think about how we share the roads. So do we give more cyclists dedicated cycle lanes? Do we widen paths to get everyone on the roads? Or maybe do we implement road safety measures such as 20-mile-per-hour speed limits or speed humps? And the same goes for rural areas, and try and consider how we can share the roads. Another question is, how do you become a transport planner? So there's really two ways. So the way I went to uni and studied economics. However, you don't have to study economics or go to uni at all. If you do end up at uni, you can, I believe, geography, transport planning is a degree, or a mathematics degree, can really help you. But there are also apprenticeships available at big companies. I believe my company, Stantec, do have apprenticeships for transport planners that allow you to get a foot in the door. You don't also have to work for a private company. You can work for the local council. So if you work as a planner, you'll usually given an option to shift over and become a transport planner. What are my career goals? I would say continue doing what I'm doing and continue to learn more about transport planning. I mean, there's so much that it covers. Since we cover so many different modes of transport, from car to ferry, there's really so much that I've yet to learn, and I just want to continue learning and keep working my way up in the company. Another question is, were you also always interested in transport? What were your favorite subjects at school? Yeah, I was always interested in transport in some way. It was more just being interested about how people get around. I mean, I lived in quite a rural area of the US, so we had to use car, and it was also always thinking, how could a bus be implemented? And when I went to uni, I actually didn't know transport planning was an option. So once I graduated, I saw transport planning was an option. I applied for it and managed to get the job. My favorite subjects at school were more STEM related. It was more maths. At the time, I didn't quite see how it could be applied to what I was doing. But once I fully started doing economics and realized that there is a real practical application for this, that I really wanted to continue doing that and managed to do it as a job. That being said, transport planning isn't just data analysis. There is that storytelling element to it too. Another question would be, where has the best transport in the world? I'd probably think, I'd say probably Japan, with the way there's so many metro lines, so many train lines, bus and all that, and it's all perfectly timed and it's priced that you can use every day. I believe Japan doesn't have a lot of people who own cars just because it's too expensive and it's a lot easier to take the train. So another question, how can people find out more about transport planning? Um, we have a society, which is a membership. So if you are interested in becoming a transport planner, you don't have to pay anything to get onto it. It's called the Transport Planning Society. And they have a whole bunch of information about the different types of transport planning and how you can get involved in being a transport planner. They also hold webinars, so you're able to go in and listen. Even if you think you might be a little bit interested in it, I'd recommend you go along and just listen to what they have to say. As there's quite a lot of different things that you don't know about transport, or the little nuances of transport until you really research it. So again, I'd recommend going to the Transport Planning Society website. So another question, what does a day in your job look like? So I'm quite lucky where I have hybrid working. So some days I work from home and some days I work in an office. Either way, it doesn't really affect what I do. Most days I work on multiple projects, so you're not just stuck to one project at a time. And depending where the project is, some days I might do data analysis, some days I might do report writing, and some days I might be speaking to stakeholders. That being said, too, you're not just doing it on your own. I work within teams usually, so there's a lot of opportunity to speak to more senior members and figure out experiences or how I should research something or how I should present something. There's not really a typical day in a life. It really depends on what projects you're working on. And again, that variety, to me at least, it makes it really rewarding and makes my job extremely interesting. So I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time and listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.